Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session. I'm really excited to welcome you to the our session on the environmental communications and the cost of living crisis. And I'm joined here by some fantastic speakers. We have Caroline Sigley from the National Trust, Ruth Hyde from Woodland Trust, and Rob Percival from the Soil Association, all great communicators. So what we're going to be doing today, I realize I'm just jumping in, but we've got 92 participants here already. So I'm assuming everybody's got a coffee in hand and refreshed from lunchtime. What we're looking at today is how environmental organizations are responding to the current cost of living crisis. Also looking at how it's changing our operations, if at all, our communication and engagement programs, and even sometimes our ambitions. And also, if we can, looking at whether it represents an opportunity or indeed a crisis for the sector. So I think, one of the, just a little bit about me as well. I work as freelance as an environmental communicator. So I do media and PR predominantly for environmentally minded organizations. And I work at a small business called Under the Trees, which is that freelance business. So I've been in this sector for a very long time. I've also worked happily with Rob many years ago at the Soil Association. And also more recently, I've worked with Forestry England. And I think some of my old colleagues are on the line. So looking forward to seeing your questions come in. One of the things that I think I've seen in the last couple of weeks and months, especially as far as charities are concerned, when it comes to the cost of living crisis, is a real sort of, and this is on a personal level from many people that I knew in sort of charitable sector, is this hesitation and almost an embarrassment for asking for money during a time which is obviously incredibly difficult for many people. And I think that's of course something that's natural. And the cost of living crisis, indeed, it does represent a major threat to organizations and charities working in environmental and conservation sectors. And it's not, I think, as we've seen this week, it's not just, members of the public that were asking for money. But there was news the other day that the English National Opera was losing their entire tranche of funding, which was, I think, almost £13 million from Arts Council England. So from a funding perspective, of course, this is a challenge as well. And, Marion Spain in her keynote, if anybody saw it earlier, fantastic keynote, she was one of the speakers. So we've had this sort of great progress over the last few years, where initially nature was sort of seen as like nature for nature's sake. And now we've moved to a place where nature is actually seen as a solution, which is fantastic. But indeed that the cost of living crisis really challenges people's views around this and can change their views. So I think I wanted to start, what we're hopefully going to do over the next 45 minutes is we're going to start with some introductions, and I'm going to ask some provocations to our speakers. And feel free to chat. I'm going to try and keep on top of the chat and just keep my eye on it to see if I can bring anything interesting into the discussion. But do also feel free to ask any questions, which we'll hopefully answer in the last few minutes of the session. So do, if you can, try and put your questions in the Q&A. It just, sometimes the chat moves very quickly, so it just, hopefully we'll keep it in the right place and we'll be able to see it. So I'm going to start off with provocations to each of you, and I'm happy for you to take about 5 minutes or so to answer this, on your charity's behalf. And I'd also hope to have a bit of an introduction to, for each of you to do a bit of an introduction, who you are, at the same time. So my provocation to both Ruth and Caroline, and I can repeat this again, if we start with Caroline, how can you effectively communicate with on-the-ground staff, volunteers, donors, members, and other people during a cost of living crisis?
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, so I'm Caroline Sigley. I'm actually the head of external comms for the National Trust. So my main area is the proactive and reactive work that the Trust does, getting our stories in and keeping them out of print and broadcast. Just in terms of context, I think the cost of living crisis has hit the National Trust in a number of ways. We've got 10,000 members of staff, many of whom are low paid in the F&B and retail sector, 44,000 volunteers, obviously unpaid. It's a huge organisation. That F&B sector has been hit by staffing issues and increased costs. And we've got a very large portfolio. So even if you just think about the 200 stately homes that we have to heat, our heating bills have doubled, for example. And also we know that we are dealing in a more difficult financial crisis, in that the numbers, our anticipated growth in members is reduced. So obviously we anticipated a number of members per year, and we know now that because of the cost of living crisis, we're going to see a reduction in that. But at the same time, we have to increase our membership price. So what we did was we created a boilerplate which all comms come off. So that's internal communications when we're doing policy and advocacy work, when we're doing external comms for fundraising. And the key messages that we put in that boilerplate of communication about the cost of living crisis were things like, we know it's touched everybody, that's staff and visitors. We're grateful for continued support. Every single pound goes back into what we do. We will scale back our plans, so we're taking it seriously ourselves and have moderated some of our own growth, but you as a visitor or a member of staff won't feel that difference, and then sort of reiterate why that work is more important than ever. And I can post that boilerplate in the space here. And then we have done some tactical stuff as well. So our staff grades 7 to 11 will be given a support payment. And we've established some internal comms on where staff and volunteers can get support. We've asked all our areas to reduce energy use by 15%. We've paused additional headcount. We're pausing some project spend, and we obviously use that boilerplate when we go out with communications around that. For members and visitors, we've actually been quite generous. We've given 1 million free passes away through a QR code. That's not too bad, actually. Redemption rates are 5 to 10%. So we saw quite a lot of uptake around the October half term with that. We've also trialled at a quarter of our places at half term. If you spend £5 in a cafe, kids eat for free. And again, we use that boilerplate in terms of why we're doing what we're doing. And then in fundraising, we have changed a few things. So for example, there's a social post that goes out, Giving Tuesday, and rather than asking for monetary donations to plant a tree or other funds, we're doing a sort of non-cost gift, which is, can you give some books to any of our secondhand bookshops instead? And in February, when we do our Facebook challenge, we're going to set donations at the lower end of the scale rather than at the higher end of the scale. And then also, just in addition to the stuff that we're doing today, I do have some sector meetings with English Heritage and Royal Horticultural Society and other people, just to find out if we're on the same page with others in the sector about what we're doing, how we're communicating, what free offers we're giving, and how we're going to balance that work. And then obviously a little bit later on, we're going to have to go out with some communication about how our membership prices have increased. We've frozen them for 3 years and they will go up. And obviously we've seen some additional costs in our F&B costs too. But again, we just use that boilerplate in every sort of communication that we do around this cost of living crisis. So that's how the National Trust has responded.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That sounds, it sounds huge, doesn't it? I mean, again, you know, I used to be a National Trust member, and you have such a huge remit, and you know, from the moment that you step onto the estate or the grounds of a National Trust property, you see the volunteers, of course you go in, you have you have a coffee, and it seems like when you think about the challenges that you're up against, it is very serious. But it sounds like you've made done a range of measures there to help, and I was especially interested in the support payment. Maybe we can get into talking about that later, because I do want to go around, but to see that, and I don't know how many charities are doing that, but I think it's the idea of a support payment to staff is can be quite substantial. So thank you so much for that. I think I'm going to go to Ruth next. I'm going to ask you the same question, Ruth, which I will repeat just in case you didn't get that. So how can you effectively communicate with on the ground staff, volunteers, donors, members and others during a cost of living crisis?
Thanks for that, Hayley. So I'm Ruth Hyde. I'm Director of Brand and Communications at the Woodland Trust. We are the largest woodland charity in the UK, but put into context in relation to the National Trust, we have something over 600 staff. We have over 1,000 woods, from really tiny to huge tracts of land, huge estates, particularly in Scotland. Our business model is completely different, so it's free access to all our sites. So our ability to raise money from our estate is practically non-existent. So our business model is very, very different. We've certainly looked at staff salaries, and so that side of thing I think we've got covered. But actually, our ability to communicate, it's a very, very different offer. So the people who support us as members, they do so without getting any benefit in return, other than knowing that they're doing a good thing. So they don't get free access to our sites because that already exists. And I think what's important to us is we've got quite a diverse range of sources of income. So that does mean that, you know, we can look across that and see where we need to put more effort in or less effort in, depending on what the climate is at any particular point in time. So that's quite a positive thing for us. But, you know, the context is, there's something like, according to the Charities Aid Foundation, about a quarter of people have already said they're reducing or stopping supporting charities, and potentially another 14% thinking about it. So that's, you know, the big numbers there. Equally, on the other hand, it's not affecting everybody in the same way. So there are still people who are not being affected. And so for us, I think the really important starting point is, don't stop communicating, don't stop doing your marketing activity. And yet that's quite often what happens in the event of a crisis. It's stop your marketing spend. And it's probably the worst thing that you can do. So if anything, for me, the key thing is we need to communicate, and we need to communicate more. And even listening to some of the things that Caroline was saying. So for me, one of the things is it's about having the evidence when you're doing, you need to be able to communicate your impact. And whether that's your staff, whether it's volunteers, whether it's major donors, whether it's some of the grant organisations we go to, if you haven't got the evidence of your impact, you're going to really, really struggle. So some of it's about changing the emphasis. So very much about what Caroline said, you know, it's about valuing every pound we get in. And this is what happens as a consequence of that. So I think for me, that is a really fundamental thing. I think it's also important to talk about the issue. So let's not hide it. Let's be really clear that there is an issue, because in some cases, actually being upfront about it can make a difference. And I'll give you, and it's quite a difficult example to mention this one, but we had a massive cyber attack nearly 2 years ago, and we eventually communicated with our members and our supporters. And actually, some people were going, you know, they were really supportive in return. And yet it was almost like the worst thing that could have happened to us. But by being upfront about it, it was actually really helpful in terms of actually generated some extra money at that point in time. But it was more about that feeling of goodwill and support for us, which was priceless in a lot of ways. And I also recall, and this is going back a long time ago, but there used to be a thing around, I used to work in tourism, and I was involved in seaside resorts, and they always presented a really positive picture about, you know, coming to the resort, all the wonderful things that were going on around. But actually that was a real problem, because there was a lot of dreadful stuff going on. There was a lot of lack of investment, because people are going, it's fine, the resorts are doing really well. And we have to be positive when you work in tourism, but actually it was actually detrimental, because you weren't getting the investment associated with it. And eventually a report was commissioned called Beyond the Facade, and it was actually looking behind that. And actually most resorts at that point in time were some of the most deprived places in the country, but it had all been smoke screened. So for me, there's another point. So don't stop communicating, and be prepared to say, this is a difficult time for us and we need your support more than ever before. So for me, I think in terms of going forward, that they are probably the two things I'd want to really emphasize at this point in time. And then just added on a third one to that, because it's really important. Don't assume that people aren't prepared to support you anymore, because I think it's very easy to go, they can't afford it. And some people won't be able to, and some organisations will be retrenching as well. But that assumption means that you're not actually then being really proactive in terms of looking for income coming in to support what you're doing.
Fantastic, Ruth. I think those are some, you put into, a couple of points there, some really, really key messages. And I think, again, that idea that, not stopping, not, reducing your communications and continuing to communicate is really, really quite interesting and crucial also. And I think that example that you brought up about the cyber attack, which must be a horrendous thing for a charity, for any organization to go through. But seeing that there is that, that sort of solidarity with your members is, they're obviously not something that you want to have to go through again, but certainly a silver lining to a very bad situation. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on to Rob Percival from the Soil Association. And just so Rob, one of the reasons that we wanted, I know that Savita and the host wanted to, talk about and bring you on is that we thought it would be really interesting to discuss this from a food perspective. So this is why we asked the Soil Association to join us, because I think you, Rob, the organization's in a particularly interesting place, because not only is it food, but it's organic food, which is very good for the environment. I will, having worked at the Soil Association, some can disagree with, but I think is, very, more environmentally conservation minded approach to farming than some. However, it's also very expensive. And while we're seeing these sort of soaring cost of food, and I think I was looking at something from a few weeks ago that was sort of figures for food, the cost of food price rises. And I think, it had been about 15% from last September to this September in terms of the price rise. And that's obviously, huge. And I don't know what the figures are for organic, but I can imagine it's not cheap to produce food generally, and certainly not organic food. So I think it would be really brilliant to sort of get your take on all of this and on the cost of living situation, maybe bringing in some of your own experiences, from a sort of, from a policy perspective, or, indeed the sort of the thoughts of the people who are buying organic food at the moment.
Certainly. Thank you, Hayley. And thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Percival. I'm head of food policy at the Soil Association. We're an organisation, as Hayley mentioned, that campaigns for organic food and farming, but also more broadly for healthy and sustainable food and farming. We work across the food system, changing the way that farmers are working the land, changing the way that people are eating, and with everything in between. And this is a good challenge. What is the role of organic in a cost of living crisis? I think first of all, it's worth establishing what organic food is. You might have come across it in a supermarket. It has a little stamp on it. Broadly speaking, this is food grown in a nature-friendly way, without agrochemicals, free from fossil fuel-based fertilizers, in farming systems that really try to work with nature to generate healthy foods. And it's certified. The standards are in law, so it comes with its stamp saying that it is what it says it is. And it's fairly niche, and that's part of the reason it's more expensive. It's organic food is the market's growing year on year, but it's small compared to the conventional food market. And the really important point in relation to the cost of living crisis is that if we were farming organically, or in more broadly agroecological organic style farming systems, we would be shielded from many of the price rises that we're currently facing. Food prices are rising because energy prices are rising, and that's putting up the cost of fossil fuel-based fertilizers. It's putting up the cost of transport for industrial animal feed. There's a whole series of issues associated with fossil fuel use, which are flowing through into food prices, and organic is shielded from that because we're producing food in a different way. We're not using those fossil fuel-based fertilizers and so on. So you can say, hypothetically, if we'd invested in this style of farming 10 years ago, we'd be in a much more resilient space right now, and we'd be shielded from some of this. For the squeezed middle, there's a demographic out there who are feeling the cost of living squeeze, but who can still afford to buy organic. I think the key message is to reassure them that there is still an important role for this, that we need to look to the future and accelerate, just as we are in the energy space, a move to a post-fossil fuel system, a move to a post-fossil fuel based food system. And organic has a key role in that, so it's worth investing in. But of course, as you mentioned, not everyone can afford to buy organic or even food at all at the moment. The cost of living crisis is having a serious impact on families. Many children are going to school hungry, parents are skipping meals and so on. It's really serious. So we've been focusing some of our efforts on public institutions, schools and hospitals, where we can reach some of those struggling families. We have a catering scheme called Food for Life, which works with these institutions, works with their caterers to put organic and more sustainable food on the plate. And we're working in some of the most deprived areas of the country, in Oldham and Tower Hamlets, and so on, to make sure that more sustainable meals aren't a middle class niche. They are being eaten by children and families around the country. And we're also redoubling our efforts in an advocacy space, calling for an expansion of free school meals and calling for government action to make sure that some of those most vulnerable are able to access this food. So all that translates across, I think, to two broad implications, which probably resonate with other NGOs and charities. The first is to focus on systemic solutions instead of sticking plasters, and we're really framing organic and agroecology as a systemic solution, a long-term solution to the underlying drivers of this cost of living crisis. And secondly, linked to that, we're dialing up our efforts proportionately, targeting those who need them the most, hence our focus on free school meals and school food at the moment. So there's lots of work to do, but it's only accentuated, we think, this crisis, the need to implement the solutions that we're proposing.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. That was really, really interesting to see where the Soil Association is focusing, and also, again, certainly on the, getting back to the cost of living crisis and some of the drivers and the implications. Seeing that actually we need to stop looking, as you say, at sticking plaster solutions and find actual solutions before things become a problem. I'm going to go back to something that that Ruth was talking about, and I'm going to put this question out to all or any of you. And actually, we just have had something on the chat here about this sort of interest. We're all communicators, and of course, there is this. I was talking in the introduction about this feeling that I've had from some people where they're just a bit embarrassed talking about asking for money or doing sort of charitable work. And it's talking about this idea that there is this sort of disempowering doom and gloom narrative that can be trotted out when it comes to environmental conservation communications. And so I think the question that I'd ask are, what, Ruth, you said we need to keep communicating. I think I absolutely agree with that. I don't think anybody would disagree with it, most of us being communicators here. But what are these narratives that we should be telling at this point, with this in the background, that there are certain doom and gloom narratives that can be told potentially for us and that we want to avoid?
I think for me, the starting point does come back to the evidence of the impact that any organisation has, because that's got to be the fundamental part of your story. And communication is all about storytelling, isn't it? So that starting point is you need a good story to tell. And I wouldn't say forget about the crisis we're in, but you've got to have that good story to start with. And it's got to be something that is credible and that you believe in yourself. Because if you can't tell a story and that you feel really positive about it, it's really difficult for the person at the other end to actually take it seriously. So for me, having a really, really clear story is very important. And then you actually look at some of the costs involved in terms of, so if you look at our membership, if you look at the National Trust membership, actually, in the scheme of things, some of these are not significant costs. And you think, if I go to a football match, I don't even know how much that costs anymore, but I know it's really, really expensive. So there are things about, we need to have that story and also be able to value what we're offering as well, because it's very easy to go, you know, in our case, it's from £4 a month, which is, you know, it's probably just over a cup of coffee in Starbucks or somewhere like that. It's not a significant amount of money every month, and yet the difference it makes to us if thousands of people do that is really important. So I think there's a bit of, when you're going out with your story, I wouldn't necessarily say it's cheaper than a cup of coffee or it's a cup of coffee a month, because that's not going to help anybody. But knowing that yourself, and knowing how, particularly if it's face-to-face conversation, that actually that's what we're looking at, that's really important. So I think it's important to, you know, to kind of rationalize the costs of doing this with actually the impact that it actually generates as well. So and in a face-to-face situation, that's much easier to do. So when you've got face-to-face recruitment, that's so much easier. But I think it's also part of that story that you need to tell. People get such a lot of value from giving a fairly small amount of money. And then I suppose as well, we also had, certainly early lockdown, when I think about it, there were people who were our supporters and said, look, I can't afford this now, but I will come back to you at some point in the future. And they tended to. So there's also something about, we need to be quite flexible as well, is there will be people where every penny makes a difference. And therefore it's leaving that door open for them as well. So I think that's something we need to consider as well. We need to be quite humble, and we need to be really aware of what's going on. But equally, as I say, we don't need, if we undersell ourselves and we assume that people can't afford, that will come across in terms of our messaging.
Yeah, I mean, at the Trust, we've actually been highlighting an awful lot of things that people can do for free. So we've been going for sort of beyond the member base and going out to where people are. So we've had Blossom Watch at the start of the year, which is where you take a photo of blossom near you. And we've just had a huge autumn colour campaign about noticing nature and autumn colour where you are. And of course, that you can't monetize that, but it is a way to accelerate some of the work that we were going to do, which is sort of, you know, there is opportunity in the cost of living crisis, which is to engage with people in your work in the hope that they begin the journey with you, ultimately to becoming your supporter. So we have done an awful lot of work, not just in saying what the membership, to Ruth's point, what the value is for every pound that you spend, but also what we offer. We, as a charity, we are supposed to be there for everyone. And we're trying to do quite a lot of work to engage people in our work and why it matters now. And we know more than ever from after the pandemic and the lockdown that people do need nature more than they ever have. So we're communicating that really key message that here's where you can get it on your doorstep and here's where the value is, and let us help you, you know, access that wherever you are, wherever you live. And you don't have to come into the pay barrier to do that.
Thank you both. I appreciate that. And yeah, it's interesting because I was going to ask a question about the sort of operations and access, and actually we've had a question in the Q&A box about you know, to National Trust, but I think it could apply to both National Trust and to Woodland Trust, about helping people reach their properties without the need of a car. Is anything in place around that? And I know during the session earlier, the plenary session earlier with Marion Spain and Harry Bowell, which was really inspiring. You know, there was discussion around this sort of real inequality of access. So it's interesting to hear that there is that sort of opportunity to engage with your charities without having to actually set your foot on the ground. And I guess I'd ask, and you know, I'm bringing in a question early, but I think it was just sort of similar to what I was going to ask, which is there any opportunity, you know, to increasing access to, you know, you mentioned earlier, Caroline, that you've given away many tickets, and of course that's going to increase access to a certain extent. You know, is there anything else going on to try and improve that sort of that access for people who might not necessarily be able to afford it otherwise?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, you know, the other opportunity is it has accelerated our plans in a sort of testing real time, how we can get to people with a view to them sort of benefiting from our places. So in that £1 million giveaway, in addition to that, we've also been doing quite a lot of media partnership work where we're working with Reach to get into communities. So for example, we did again, it's a sort of passes giveaway. It's day passes, but we had a big intake of people who started visiting Speak Hall, which is near Liverpool. You can get to it sort of you don't have to particularly drive there. And it's because we gave some free passes away to the Liverpool Echo. And what that means is you're getting to people who you wouldn't normally have got to through traditional channels, and they're coming to your places. And then from then there's also the secondary spend, which is great, but also it's that opportunity to engage and possibly convert into members. So yeah, as well as the QR code, we've also been doing some really targeted regional media work where we're going into sort of inner city areas or conurbations, high populations, to see if we can get people who wouldn't normally think about visiting us into that sort of engagement funnel. Hopefully, where they come to our places, have a good time. There's visitors reception, and we can get some interaction going.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Caroline. I have a question now for Rob, and I've seen something pop up in the chat which was similar to what I was going to ask. But Rob, you mentioned bringing organic food and sort of better quality, better farmed food to public institutions, hospitals, schools, and actually helping people eat better for less. And I wonder, I think that's again, that's an issue of accessibility, and that's breaking down the barriers and really putting it front and center. And I think one of the questions that I have, which tags onto the question or the sort of the comment on the Q&A, is that how can you get the message across that this sort of food system, the benefits of this food system, and indeed, Lucy from ZSL has asked, like, how can we recommend the sort of meaningful actions without having a guilt burden about the inability to actually pay for these, these solutions? Sorry, that was a big question to ask.
No, that's a great question. I mean, as an organisation, we sort of bridge policy and advocacy on the one hand, and also sort of programmatic delivery on the other. So we're out working in communities, both through the Food for Life programme and a Sustainable Food Places network, which brings together local actors to start working together towards making healthy and sustainable food a sort of normal part of what's going on in that place. And so we're quite rooted in the experiences of local communities, the struggles that families and communities are facing in relation to the cost of living crisis. And out of that programmatic work, we have some good case studies of ways that people can engage in solutions locally, ways that they can get involved in shifting their local food system, supporting struggling families, helping to bring about the sort of change that we want to see. And at the same time, as an organisation, we're giving various opportunities for engagement. Beyond telling people to eat organic food, we also run campaigns. You can sign petitions, you can lobby your MP and so on. So what we want to create really is an enabling environment where people who are concerned about the impacts of the cost of living crisis in relation to food can take action on multiple fronts, can feel empowered to be part of the solution, either through one of these local programs or through lobbying. I think that, yeah, if the crude messaging was on buy organic, then there'd be all sorts of complications around feeling guilty. Can you afford to do that? But actually there are multiple solutions, and what we're trying to show is that those solutions are already sort of emerging from a grassroots space. So there's lots of ways that anyone who cares about this agenda can get involved. Not sure if that answers your question, but
Yeah, I think it does. I don't know if it answers Lucy's question, but Lucy, you can come back to Rob with a secondary question if you have one, and we'll answer it if we have time. I think Kate also just put a question across. I realize that we're sort of doing, I have some questions for all of you where this is a bit more fluid. I'm answering, we're getting to some questions already. But Kate put across something that I was also going to discuss, which is this idea of communications, your communication strategies, but also media channels. And are you changing the way that you communicate at the moment? Are you changing the channels that you communicate on? And as Kate says, or is it sort of is it more focused on the sort of messaging and engagement about what each of you and your charities are doing?
Well, at the Trust, to Ruth's point, we in areas that we are cutting back, we also understand that brand sentiment and marketing is really important. So we are actually increasing marketing in particular to drive visits. So you'll see much more property, local marketing. So there is some increased budget, definitely. So those, in terms of channels, of course, we'll be doing what we can in free media on our own channels, but it also, you'll see some more direct, not just brand awareness, but visit driving through paid marketing.
Thanks, Caroline.
I think for us, we're not increasing our budgets, but we're maintaining them at the moment. And I think, and every time we do a sort of significant size of campaign, we tend to use different channels depending on what's right for that particular campaign and that audience. So there isn't a set formula, it's this. So every time we look at what we're doing, which is the audience that we want to particularly talk to at any point in time. So for me, that's really important, is actually which audience you're trying to get to with this particular campaign and this message. So we have what we call the green audience, but that's around 15 million people in the population. And these are the people who are committed and ready to act for the environment, but they might not necessarily have acted to date. So they will have done. But 15 million, you've got everybody in that green group. There's the people that will probably recycle, but then they'll probably go on lots of long haul holidays and not see a disconnect with that. And then you get sort of to the really dark green, who are really, really environmentally focused. So what works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. You know, there's all those bits in between. So what we are doing more and more is being really clear about which part of the green audience are we targeting at a particular point in time, and then what's the best way to meet them. And that does change. Also, it changes in terms of, well, what's the cost of advertising on a particular medium at any point in time, because that can really vary depending on what else is going on in the world. So last year we did some activity around COP, and actually that was probably one of the most expensive times for us to be buying media. So different times of the year you get different costs, but it has to be very much based on the audience and then working out what's the best way of meeting those. So I think the channel mix is something that is an ongoing, it's quite a dynamic thing for us in terms of who we get to and which campaign we're going out with at any particular point in time.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, and I guess it's hindsight, isn't it? And I'm sure it's quite a noisy time as well to be talking during COP. I mean, here we are having the conference during COP. It's a challenge, but I guess that's really interesting to hear. And I think channel mix certainly does make a lot of sense. And as things change and progress. Rob, do you have any thoughts from the Soil Association perspective? I appreciate you don't work in the media or the communications team, but I know that you're very closely work very closely with them.
Yeah, I am a step removed, so I know we have been reframing our messaging. I don't really know how we've been shifting use of our channels, but we've done a lot of audience mapping in the last few years to try and understand who's receiving our messages through each of those channels. So I'm sure some of that will be feeding back into the sort of reframing, but no, I don't have a clear picture of what we're doing on that front.
That's fine, thank you. I have another question, which is from the other side. What is the response from members to your sort of your positions and your changing communications? Have they responded positively, negatively, otherwise?
So from a Soil Association perspective, we have been dialing up our campaigning efforts the last 6 months or so. This is not directly in relation to the cost of living crisis, but we're framing some of our communications in that space and trying to join up much more cohesively our policy and advocacy work with a clear sort of citizen engagement ask and a fundraising ask, and that's proven very successful. So we're working slightly differently across the organisation. This was in the particular campaign I'm referring to was in relation to intensive livestock, but the sort of joined up approach that we took has proven to be very successful in terms of citizen engagement. So I think we're on a journey with that and thinking about how we build on that more cohesive cross-organizational approach to citizen engagement and looking ahead with the cost of living crisis in mind. We have some more work in the pipeline around struggling families and free school meals and so on. So we'll be trying to replicate that approach. But I think that it is a space in which campaigning can, if you get the right hook, can land well, because there's a lot of motivated people out there who are concerned about what's going on in the world.
And I guess even if they can't, afford to support you, they can also, it's much easier to write a letter to your MP or to, click on a petition. Thanks. Ruth or Caroline, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, offers for us have been well received. The trial of the Kids Eat Free has been good. I think that brand warmth is high as well, and member retention is there, and the membership is growing. It's just not at the rates that we'd predicted. But our recent AGM does see some challenges. Our head of support and revenue was challenged about why we've introduced the use of disposable cups again in some of our cafes, and it's because we don't have the staff to hand wash crockery anymore. So you've got a choice between opening and building some revenue and giving your members what they want when they come and experience your places, or doing something which it's not ideal in terms of sustainability. So there was quite a lot of challenge on that. And also our recent rewilding resolution is really, we're really trying to work hard, a bit like Rob was saying, and that nature friendly farming is not at the deficit of food production. The two things go hand in hand, but there is, along with the cost of living crisis, there's a huge concern about food security and food production, and why, as the biggest landowner, aren't we turning into the sort of breadbasket of Britain instead of worrying about butterflies and pollinators and hedgerows? And it's so our AGM was a sort of example of some of the challenge that we're getting, but largely I would say we're doing all right in terms of communicating our message at this tricky time. We've just been very transparent that we know it's hard for our staff, it's hard for our volunteers, it's hard for us as a business, and it's also hard for members, but we've just got to dig in and get through and find a way to work through it and offer something of value to people. And we think we do, and we hope we do.
I think for us as well, ours is more, I think I'd reiterate Caroline, it's about the membership growth, which is the most challenging part. So we had some quite ambitious targets for this year, and I think we will struggle, whereas the people that are supporting us already, they've been supporters for quite a long time, they're warm to what we're doing, they've been very loyal. But I think it's actually around the growth. And for us, the growth isn't just about the money, it's about that, the nature crisis and the climate crisis are the things that are kind of getting swept under the carpet in terms of the economic crisis. Well, they all need to go hand in hand. We can have a better economy that is an environmentally good economy, it's good for biodiversity, it's good for climate change. We can do that. And at the moment, it feels like the things are being seen as separate. Well, actually, there's no point having a great economy if the environment is really poor and getting more and more degraded. And that is a really important message to get out. So there's been a lot of work being done with the environmental charities getting together and around the attack on nature. But it is the attack on the climate. We've got to have a good economy, but we also have to have one that is an environmentally sound economy as well. And so some of our messaging really needs to be around that as well. Now, that's not necessarily going to bring us more supporters in, but it's really important in terms of the way we talk to our corporate partners, the way we talk to funders as well, because they're just as important. And I would say in some ways more so at this point in time, because they're the people who can start fighting that battle for us and step up and say, we need a good green economy to help support the crisis that we're in at the moment.
Thanks. Yeah, it's bringing it back to that sort of original, not just about the situation that we're in now, but the the sort of the wider picture. And I think thank you all for that. We've only got about 2 more minutes, and I know Ellie's going to be reminding me of that if she hasn't already. But I see there's a question that we haven't answered in the Q&A. I know that there's some in the chat, but this is from Alice, and actually it sort of leads on nicely to what you were talking about, Ruth. So I'm just going to offer this up to anybody who might want to answer it, because I think we'll be a bit pushed for time. But so the panel, Alice is wondering if the panel has started to consider how their organizations might extend the conversation beyond the immediate, how nature benefits humans, to a more mutual flourishing with nature conversation.
I think that's part of what we do and have been doing for years, actually, rather than something that we need to build on to what we're doing now. Hopefully, we should have been doing that already. I hope, hopefully we are engaging that. And sometimes, like I said, in these crises, so we've had so many, haven't we, from Ukraine to now the cost of living and COVID, they do present the opportunity to reconnect people to what actually really matters and what's at stake here, as well as Ruth was saying, doing that sort of high challenge of government when you think that that's at risk. So hopefully if we're doing our jobs right, we should have been doing that anyway.
Thanks, Caroline. Thank you all. I think we've got 1 minute to spare, but I expect it's gonna be gobbled up very quickly by the clock. So I just want to take this this time to say thank you all so much for joining us, Rob, Caroline, and Ruth, and thank you so much to all the people who are behind the scenes, watching, listening, sending in questions, and chatting. It's been a pleasure to have talked to you all and to have listened to the chit chat, kept my eye on the chit chat here. So thank you so much. And I'm actually not sure when the next session starts. I'm assuming it's in probably 15 minutes time. So yeah, it's probably 2 o'clock. You can pop back to the lobby and see who's on. I should have seen who that was, but unfortunately I didn't before the session.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.